Welcome, everyone. This is Mark Lindsay. Thanks for joining us for our webinar on malware and voice and video networks. We're going to get started here in just a few seconds. This is a common topic that we work with in our service provider clients, where they are concerned about the security and the robust reliability of the network, and we've seen an uptick in interest in security defense, especially risks related to malware. And so this is partially a result of some research that we did last year and some discussions, some things that were going on across the landscape, and it continues today. So it's a very relevant topic for us right now. So we are going to go through a few items here. I'm Mark Lindsay, senior member of technical staff, and I've been doing research on security and network scenarios since 1993. So this has been an ongoing long-term topic. For me, the malware landscape has changed. When I first got into it, the first internet worm kind of network spread malware was only a few years in the past. But now it's been quite a while. So today our agenda that we're going to cover is a background on malware, what it is, especially in the context of voice service providers, and other types of service providers and critical infrastructure. I want to talk about sort of evidence of malware affecting core servers, and especially in the telecom industry. Then you talk about defenses against malware and some actionable lessons that you can take away. So ECG is a engineering firm, as well as providing software and 24/7 network monitoring services and customized customer service. We do a lot of network monitoring within that, which includes security monitoring. And what this is just some information from what we see out there on the threat landscape, and so you could take this and hopefully apply it directly in your service provider and your network. So first, we'll talk a bit about now what is malware in a little bit more detail. So malware is a portmanteau for malicious software, and it's been around as a term for a while, just sort of generally in the PC world. We originally just used the term viruses were the most common, or sometimes you'd hear of Trojans. The first network malware, the first major example of that was the internet worm that came out and became active in 1988. It caused some widespread crashes, and it exploited bugs through a couple of protocols, including internet mail through SMTP, and also through a finger protocol, which was a sort of a directory and presence protocol that was used at the time. The way it worked is it was able to connect to each server and then launch and install a copy of itself. It actually was cross-platform, so it actually ran on multiple operating systems at the same time. So that was a pretty interesting distinctive, that it was able to run across multiple platforms, partially because of commonalities between the different platforms. So it was able to spread, and what it did was effectively create a widespread distributed denial of service attack. It didn't make anyone any money. It was a student who actually launched it. It got it started, and once he got it started, it was surprisingly effective. It kept working. So how does malware spread? So there's a lot of ways, and I'll show you a few examples of some of those, how malicious software spreads from system to system. The kind that we're most commonly concerned about because of its prevalence and the facility with which it can spread is through launching through the network to exploit defects. So this is coming in through network protocols. For example, if you're running a server and it's got a SIP server on there, then if there's some sort of defect with the SIP software, then you could have a vulnerability there, and then you could, if you're an attacker, you could develop an exploit that launches an attack against that vulnerability. So maybe you're able to send a specially crafted SIP message, or maybe it's an RTP datagram. You put in the RTP header that the packet size is so long, and then you actually send more data than that. And if the software is not written right, then you may be able to exploit that. So you may be able to take over a media server, or maybe a session border controller or media gateway like that. So those are kind of some of the contextual examples that we would have within telecom. But there's a lot of ways to spread the malware. So some of the famous ones recently have been the firmware on USB drive. So a thumb drive, you can hide malware there, and there's some concern about that. where if you plug in one of these devices, it doesn't necessarily have to appear as a file on the thumb drive. It can actually be in the firmware, which actually communicates with the firmware of your USB driver or of your USB hardware in your machine. So those have been successfully used to exploit systems just spreading between devices like that. It could be code running inside of PDFs. There's been exploited malware inside PDFs, and of course this has led to companies like Adobe and the Acrobat product updating to try to defend against that. But these are cases where the manufacturers are trying to debug their products to perfection. So they have some fundamental weaknesses, and they're trying to basically improve them little by little to make them better. So the net result is we're running in a world of minor defects and vulnerabilities. Some of the more famous other newer vulnerabilities that are a little more frightening because they're so hard to defend against are virtual machines running on the same host. So if you're using a VMware or similar environment, it could be Linux KVM, it could be anything, but if you got virtual machines that are running on the same host, the same physical server, there have been some recent vulnerabilities related to malware that's able to read data out of the CPU cache or the CPU registers to read content of the data that's visible, that gives visibility into other hosts or other guests running on the same machine. So the worst case would be you're using a public cloud service like Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud Hosting, and you are able to someone else is able to read the data from your platform. And so they're able to read what's going on inside your operating system and your applications, and therefore get data that should be sensitive or that you have a responsibility to protect. Another one of the cases is modified software. So sort of the so-called Trojan case, where you've got what legitimate software that you intend to install. For example, it could be your server platform that's running your SIP call processing, and or it could be a package that runs on there that's a mouse driver or something maybe you don't even really need, but it's not a problem. But in some sense, there's been a vulnerability injected into that. So there's some sort of defect that was intentionally placed there to give somebody control. Now these are pretty sophisticated type of attacks, but they're definite possibilities. They're things that have happened before. As I'm going through this, feel free to use the features in Zoom. You can to add some notes to the meeting. You can put comments into the notes, and then at the end, I'm going to look for those comments and questions that you've added, and we'll come back and we'll cover those. So feel free to add those comments in the meeting or ask those questions. So just as an example of the really quintessential classic worm, the 1988 Morse Internet worm, had a system where it would try different kinds of attacks. So RSH was a predecessor to SSH, an unencrypted predecessor. It would try to attack there. It would try to attack over the finger protocol, like I mentioned, is a directory and presence protocol, and then a sendmail attack, which was used for delivering outbound email. We try to connect to the target system, and one of those systems, if it was able to find the software bug that it was looking for, it would actually go and install a miniature piece of software that would execute. It would connect over the network and download a copy of the worm. So this effectively left each server system as a server, and then the worm would be installed on the target system and start running. And then the target system now becomes an infected system, and the attack goes on from there. It scanned through the local network. It scanned through IP addresses that it was able to reach, and so you can, in a very short amount of time, you could have all of the Unix or in this era VAX VMS systems on the network could all be attacked at basically the same time, and so within a few seconds. And so this was one of the originals. It was very effective, and it was based on, he had 3 different vulnerabilities that had been some of them known about, but they just had not been fixed yet because people were really not worried about it. And what this worm did was open everyone's eyes to the possibility that this kind of worm could potentially be a real problem, that this kind of malware attack could be a real problem. And in his case, he was almost doing it as an experiment. There was no money earned. A more modern example here, where we show the interaction between a Windows machine that's used on a Linux machine, is it's shown here. We've got a couple of malware versions that are in use at the same time. So on the top right, we have one that's running a Linux server running the Chapro.a vulnerability. So it's got basically software running on it, malware running on it. And then you've got on the left-hand side, you've got a regular, let's say a Windows computer, and it's connecting the server on the right is just a web server. So most of the servers that their computer connects to out on the internet today are, of course, Linux machines. And so if one of those Linux machines has it, then this is a modification of the way that the web server software is running. When it gets that request, it actually connects to a command and control server, which is one of the common features of these designs, so that you will have a botnet of systems that are infected, but they have no intrinsic damage capability. They're just basically infected servers, and they are able to be controlled remotely. So they're effectively, those infected machines can connect outbound to get those instructions on where to go next. And that's what's happening here. Is this web server is just an ordinary Linux machine with this exploit that's installed. It's connecting to the CNC server, and then the CNC server sends back instructions. And in this particular case, it sends back a cookie, and then later on, the laptop that's running the wrong version of the web browser downloads a web page from perhaps even the same server, but inside that web page there are instructions to connect directly to the exploit hosting server, which is a different command and control server. And so now you've got a different vulnerability. The ZBot 132 ZBot may be installed on this server to allow the command and control server, the malware hosting server, to be able to control that Windows machine. So in this case, we've got a combination of a Linux machine on the top right hand side, which has been exploited, compromised, and is running one malware variant based on, in this case, a web server and operating system defect. And on the left-hand side, we've got another operating system defect that was used to exploit, and so that the system, the attackers have control over both the Windows computer on the left and the Linux machine on the right, and they're using them basically to spread the virus in this way. So this one came from the security site We Live Security, who gave this example to us. But this was one here that came out just within the past year. One of the famous examples of malware that was used as a weapon was the Stuxnet virus that appears to be developed by government entities. And there's a lot of tools that they use to put it together. So Stuxnet was extremely sophisticated and put a lot of pieces together in order to accomplish this goal. So its goals evidently were to destroy centrifuges that were made by Siemens. And so these Siemens centrifuges were controlled by programmable logic controllers, the PLCs that are mentioned here on the bottom right. But there were a lot of tools that had to go together to get this, because the network that was used, it was a factory network in the defense organization within the country of Iran, and so they had gone to some substantial effort to provide security, but Stuxnet was able to launch an attack, even though the attacked machines were not connected to any network, or they may not have been connected to any network at the time. So some of the tools that were used as part of this were connections through the firewall for remote. Insecure remote support. So basically, folks who were able to log in to help manage PCs, they were able to log in from systems, and so the attack could be launched from the remote support. And so effectively, it's supposed to be a tool just to allow PC users to get help on their machines, but it was used to install malware on some of the PCs. But these are not the PCs that were actually connected to the factory. These are just PCs internal to the network. We've got the Office network here, where we had, they get the most common form of malware distribution now is email that has an attachment in it, or email that says to download a file. And so Office PCs are often compromised because these regular users have access to download this material. connect to the internet and install these worms on their own machines. And so through the office network, they were able to connect through what they show here is misconfigured firewall. So this is kind of one of the hallmarks is firewalls that allow too much through. One of the common things is a lot of our networks will have firewalls that block access from the public internet, but they don't treat our internal office corporate PCs as being untrustworthy or as being a source of danger. But as we know, it's extremely common for Windows machines and other types of devices to get malware installed on them because they can directly reach the internet, they can directly receive email. And so the firewalls are allowing these effectively these non-trustworthy machines to connect inbound to the internal networks. Some of the other tools that were actually used, there were modems that were accessible. So even though they weren't directly on the internet, there were modems that were intended for remote access to remote sites. So we had modems that were done. There were, in some cases, with Stuxnet, there were some wireless networks that were apparently could be exploited. So folks were able to connect to those wireless networks and get access to some of the internal machinery. There were some directly infected laptops. So machines that had basically were brought in. They weren't normally connected to the network, but they were temporarily plugged in. And one of the most famous examples here was infected USB key. So through some of those tools that I mentioned before, where you plug in your USB thumb drive into a machine, and you at a firmware to firmware level, they're able to install malware on the USB thumb drive itself. Some of those infective USB thumb drives were actually used in the Stuxnet distribution, so that the folks brought in thumb drives. So without even connecting the internal machines to any kind of network at all, by bringing in the thumb drive, kind of so-called sneaker net, they were able to bring in that software into the core network. And so that's happening as folks plug these things. And the interesting thing is you can't beat this kind of defect by using device encryption. Necessarily, a lot of organizations are going to have a full disk encryption or an external device disconnected media encryption, and this is happening at a layer before any of that encryption mechanism gets in place. And so this is actually happening by exploiting hardware defects. So through a variety of these kind of different tools, basically malware was able to be installed on a control network that sent through the commands to the programmable logic controllers, and therefore to affect the manufacturing process, which was used to enrich uranium in this particular case. And so there's a lot of tools, and kind of this one was super sophisticated because it was basically it was a one government acting against another government, one or more governments acting against another government. And this one definitely was predominantly effective against Iran. That seemed to be the effect here. The same sorts of tools and the same sort of multi-step exploit are expected to be more common, so that you're able to kind of get one step in, but you're not necessarily able to complete the attack by a single step. And so that's a lot of, I think, what I want to raise awareness on is that the need to defend against these multi-step attacks. In a particular, kind of the big thing for a lot of our organizations is going to be these office networks or machines that are not normally connected but are temporarily connected to the core network. And the fact that our office network machines or our management PCs can be used to launch attacks against the internal networks, because often we treat these office network PCs as if they're trustworthy. So a question, so I gave some examples of old internet servers from the 80s and Stuxnet, where we saw an active, what seems to be an active war. But is this really affecting core servers? So the servers that actually are used by companies to run telecom or just to do other operations? And the answer is yes. And so there were a couple of big events last year. WannaCry was one of them. WannaCry, it was hit a couple of organizations. FedEx was affected pretty badly, the package delivery service, and then the UK's National Health Service were hit. This was a ransomware attack where once your PC got infected, then you would send in money, and that's how you would actually pay. And because the general ledger for Bitcoin is public, we can tell how much money was actually sent in it, and people sent in $160,000. So $160,000 were directly paid for decryption keys. Fortunately, though, after only a few days, a researcher discovered the command and control mechanism was pretty vulnerable itself, and so the WannaCry software was connecting across the internet in order to distribute itself, and it was connecting across the internet to get attempt to get control, but it actually had a couple of backup mechanisms, and a security researcher was able to take over one of the backup mechanisms in a pretty easy way, simply by registering a domain name and setting up a web server. And then that actually stopped the spread because everything was connecting to his web server. So he had basically become the man in the middle, controlling the command and control system. So WannaCry was small and by comparison, but it did start to get folks' attention. But it was very shortly after that Petya and NotPetya became very active. This one was far more destructive. It's estimated that it cost $121 billion in damage. It put up this red screen, and then you had the ASCII art skull, and then it had this this display on the right where it would generate a key and it would collect money. Apparently, there's some debate over the various versions of NotPetya, whether any of them could actually decrypt. So if you sent the money in, if you send in $300 worth of Bitcoin, could you actually do anything with that? Would it actually decrypt your system? And I read varying accounts where in some cases it seemed to be effective. It actually did decrypt, and others not. But it was extremely destructive. The Lloyd's of London, the insurance carrier underwriter, estimated this $121 billion number. This puts it on par with the damage surrounding Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans in the past, and larger than a lot of other hurricanes. So it was bigger than a lot of natural disasters. A few examples of that: Maersk shipping was halted, some ports were closed. Basically, ships at sea came into port, and they just had to stop because the systems that were necessary to safely manage customs and offload the material they were shipping, the cargo, had been shut down, had been killed by NotPetya. There were some telecom providers partially disabled, notably Telefonica. Drugs manufacturing was shut down. This was because of the sensitivity of this. A lot of this was mentioned in the media, but not necessarily talked about a lot. But drugs, including especially vaccine manufacturing, was actually shut down at some of the manufacturers, and it happened it wasn't just at one site, it was happening across entire corporations in some cases. Again, FedEx was hit, and the National Health Service was again hit. They basically had between FedEx and NHS, there were a lot of vulnerable systems that had not been updated. And so this really did have some big effects. Telefonica was one of the first examples to announce publicly that they had been affected by this malware attack, and that's why we can talk about it, because they did go out and put it in the news. But they announced that some of their systems had been affected, and so this affected apparently not the call processing systems, but some of the systems that were used for business operations. So you can imagine, reading between the lines here, it appears to be things related to billing and provisioning were affected. So imagine losing the data on those billing provisioning systems, and to be honest, just imagine those systems being offline for a few weeks while the recovery is done. The interesting thing here, just in this past month, there's been some news that has come out from researchers saying the telecom firms, our industry, is being disproportionately targeted, or else it's that we're especially good at detecting these things in our industry. So this Fierce Telecom article from researcher Last Line was reporting on how telecom firms appear to be substantially above average. We get telecom firms get a lot of new versions of viruses that are sent through, and so there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are sent to and detected by telecom providers that are not reported anywhere else in the world. So the first time some of these vulnerabilities hit is they're actually going to some of you guys on this webinar. So that's an interesting factor. One of the theories is that telecom firms already have a pretty aggressive security posture, and so maybe they're detecting it a little bit more effectively. And that's definitely a possibility, but the fact is the telecom firms are, if not being directly targeted, it sure looks like they're being directly targeted by malware. And this is mostly happening not in a core servers way. This is mostly happening by emails with malware in the email, or links to malware in the email, or email based on phishing, where they're sending you an email from somebody that you think you know, and they've attached a Word document, and that Word document has a vulnerability. If you have maybe you haven't updated your version of Microsoft Office lately, and so there are a lot of things that are just like that that are being reported. Now, when we look at NotPetya, the direct attack, the actual vulnerability was on Windows servers, and so you'd have, maybe you have a network that's built with a lot of Linux systems and a few Windows servers, and those Windows servers were what went down with the recent viruses. There's been a lot of work and concern on the vulnerability of Linux servers in particular. So Linux servers are used for running most of the critical infrastructure outside manufacturing. Of course, within manufacturing, you've got a variety of things, but Linux is far and away the predominant option. It's embedded in a lot of devices, and so a lot of systems that come from manufacturers, they're running Linux, and then they have an application, installed on top of it. So the Linux is part you don't necessarily think about. But very recently, there are new vulnerabilities that are released on a regular basis. So this one that I've got up here, where it's about vulnerabilities that just came out in July, and then there's sort of an update on vulnerabilities in early this month. And this is an attack where if you can launch a type of TCP connection, you're not able to install a new software on the system, but you are able to overwhelm it so that the system shuts down. And so this, for example, could be exploited by users that if there's a malware installation that you're able to get onto Windows PCs, or you're able to get it onto your Android or your iPhone device, it could actually launch attacks that, and that device has access to maybe SSH into your core system. Then it's able to launch attacks that actually cause the TCP stack to fail, to overfill on Linux systems, so that by just having any kind of TCP access to a server, you're able to create a denial of service attack, and you're able to shut down a whole server. You can recover by rebooting the server, but then the server can be attacked again. And so there's a lot of concern around malware that directly attacks Linux machines, even if these Linux machines are partially protected by firewalls. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the key defenses against malware, some of the big areas. So defense area A is constant operating system updates. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to address the kinds of problems that our operating system and application vendors are directly fixing. So if you're working with a company like Red Hat and subscribing to their services, or using CentOS, a derivative of Red Hat, then you're able to get access to operating system updates that are intended to fix these kind of vulnerabilities. So for example, this vulnerability that I just mentioned about the kernel TCP updates, that's the sort of vulnerability that Red Hat would immediately issue an update to. Typically, they do this within less than a day. After these vulnerabilities are public, then they issue the software update so that you've got that new software available. And so that getting those operating system updates is easier said than done, and we'll talk about that some more. But as I'm sure you guys are familiar, it takes quite a lot of work to deploy these operating system updates. But this is kind of our major area A, is OS updates, so that when vulnerabilities are discovered and remediated by the OS vendor, we get the benefit of those updates. This is a common, and the commonest area of problem is that these updates, even though they're available, are not being used. The other defense area is strict firewall policy. And so by this, I don't mean that you just need a firewall, of course. What I mean is that some specific policies that are targeted to defend us against the exploit vectors, often coming in not just from the internet, but from devices that we consider trustworthy, like our management PCs, but also firewall rules that prevent connectivity out to command and control servers, and so that we don't allow our firewall to be a pathway by which our internal systems are exploited and managed. And so we'll go into some more detail on what those firewall policies should be like. So lesson number one, prepare for updates. And there's a quote from one of the directors at WebMD back in the 90s. She said, make the right thing to do the easy thing to do. And so a lot of the challenges that are in our networks doing the operating system updates that we might intellectually agree need to be done are not actually that's not actually easy to do them, or we're not really prepared to do them. And so what I'm advocating for is preparing to do them. And so OS updates are often difficult to test and install. Sometimes it's a problem with licenses. I've let my Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription expire, for example, or I'm using a version of Ubuntu that no longer has updates for it, or I don't have access to download, from those repositories. That's another common thing. Downloading that access from the repository. I have a strict firewall policy that prevents me from getting the OS updates. So a few must-haves here. One is must-have is routine monitoring for OS updates and continuous access at the same time. So this means that on a regular basis, you've got resources that are dedicated to actually monitoring for these updates and discovering when they become available. And part of that is assessing whether they need to be used and installed in your network. And then continuous access means that when you need to install them or when you're ready to begin testing them, that you've actually got regular access to this. So this can mean subscribing to Red Hat Enterprise Linux updates, or maintaining your firewall and your repositories, or building a Red Hat satellite server or spacewalk system so that you can actually have continuous access to those updates. Without that, you're not going to be able to remediate these problems or respond. And if you have to, when a vulnerability shows up, if you've got to go establish that access, then you potentially have problems where you've got to work through the delays of purchasing. You've got to work through the delays of building firewall rules, or possibly establishing new virtual machines to build your satellite infrastructure. All those kind of things are taking time. And when these vulnerabilities are announced, then basically the clock has already been ticking for a while. By the time we hear about it, outside the security community, by the time we hear about it, but by the time the OS is updated, it's definitely possible that the attackers have had some amount of time to prepare. And so we need to be ready to respond very rapidly. Another must-have is a lab network for testing and a schedule for doing so. And so in this, what I mean is that we need a place where I can actually verify that the operating system updates are not going to affect my overall operation. So if I'm running a call processing server, let's say it's GenBand or Metaswitch or BroadWorks, and I've got Linux machines in that, I need the ability to actually push those new operating system updates into that lab and actually confirm that everything starts, that everything is able to reboot, that all those functions continue to function, so that I can actually know that I'm going to have confidence to push it into production. And I need a schedule for doing so. And part of the schedule, of course, is resources, knowing that it's not going to be an emergency fire drill every time this happens, but this is a routine part of life. This is hygiene for running your network. This is not something you get to put off for a while. Just like hygiene, if you live with someone, if you have a spouse, they're not going to let you put off your hygiene. And so you're not really going to be able to put this off for very long, even though we've all developed, in the industry, we've developed some bad habits to say, well, once I installed Linux on my server, I'm sort of done for a while. I don't really have to worry about it because I've got a firewall. And that's not really going to be a working status quo. And another must-have in the sort of the category of preparation here is working redundancy for operating system patches. So redundancy, again, meaning that I have a backup system. It is ready to take over, so I can depend on it when I need to. I have systems that automatically detect a fault in my primary system. Then my backup systems are capable and they will take over at the right time, and then the rest of my network will converge on those new systems. So if I have a failure of a primary system, everything will work to make the secondary system work. It doesn't mean, by going through those 5 items I just listed, it doesn't mean that, of course, that I'm done when I have a backup. Having a backup is not enough. I have to organize the rest of my network so that it's able to automatically switch over and use that backup. And so working redundancy is really key to that. Working redundancy requires it's its own labor, and being ready so that when I need to do an update on, let's say it's an application server, I need to do an update on a DNS server or an NTP server, that I know that I'm going to be able to do that and the rest of my network will survive and operate. So having that working redundancy is a really key part of that. And this is the kind of thing ECG does. So if you guys are, so a few of you are not familiar with ECG, this is the sort of network that we build out. Is helping you test and be sure that you've got that redundancy. So a lot of times there is a lot of labor here. It's not necessarily super exciting, but we can help you with getting this done. Okay, so lesson number 2 is keep your systems patched. So once you've prepared to do the patching and you're prepared to test those updates, keeping them patched is the next step. I've got a note here. NotPetya gave you 60 days, and so for 60 days. On one day in early 2017, there was an update released by Microsoft to fix the vulnerability. And exactly 60 days later, the NotPetya exploit hit the internet, and it started primarily in Ukraine. spread from there through Europe and the US and Asia and around the world. And so there were exactly 60 days between the software update becoming available from the operating system vendor and a $121 billion economic and operational catastrophe. So that's that you could think of that as your time frame. If you want to do at least as well as NotPetya, then you've got 60 days. Now, I will say that there's another possibility. Of course, it could be less than 60 days. It could be 0 days. And so a lot of times the sort of hobbyists and geeks like to talk about 0-day vulnerabilities. 0-day vulnerabilities are definitely difficult, you know, hailstones of fire. Those are also difficult to deal with. They just don't happen very often. And so they're not the sort of things we can, where we have good tools to defend against. It is true that 0-day vulnerabilities, which is to say vulnerabilities where the exploit is released the very same day that the problem is discovered, these actually do happen, but nearly all of the vulnerabilities that have caused outages and problems, they were actually announced and remediated, fixed by the operating system vendor long in advance. And so it's kind of a false alternative to say, well, if I can't solve the 0-day problem, then I won't solve any of these problems at all. That's the lazy way out. The sort of the professional way to handle this is going to be to prepare to use every operating system update and remediation that's available and make use of those, and to get the protection that you can get. So in the case of NotPetya, which, like I said, was bigger than Hurricane Katrina, we had a 60-day window, and during those 60 days, all of these companies like the UK National Health Service, the companies that were manufacturing vaccines, FedEx and Maersk and Telefonica, they all had 60 days to install the updates. And for every system where they installed the update during the 60 days, they had no problem with NotPetya. It did not. The system neither became a vector to distribute the virus, the malware, nor did it actually get damaged itself. All we had to do was install those operating system updates. And so we've got to keep the systems patched. So we've got a relatively short time frame. 60 days is not very long if you have to go through a lot of testing. You need to be prepared so that you can do this testing on a regular basis and consistently. So must-have number 4, schedule and have the resources for your lab patch testing. So this is related to a previous one where we need to be sure that we've got the resources available to do the lab patch testing. So when the operating system updates come through, we're ready to actually use them. Must-have 5 is a phased rollout approach for your production patching. So you need to have a way of doing this. And in our paper, Preparing for the Malware Storm, we talk about some different strategies that folks take. Whether do I update the primary system or the secondary system? So if you've got BroadWorks, for example, a lot of you do have BroadWorks. Do you update the primary system or the secondary system? If you get a Cisco Call Manager update, do I update the primary or the secondary? Some of these vendors will have a preference on that. Some of them do not. Where we're doing operating system updates, and there are pros and cons to different approaches. Generally speaking, the best practice within the security industry is always to start on the lowest risk you can and then move up from there. And so if you're doing a recovery, you want to start on kind of one of your less important systems recovery after an exploit. If you're doing an OS update like this, you want to start on one of your less important systems that we're going to be able to test more things with less risk. And so if you can start small and move your way up, then that's best on your production rollout. But you're going to have to find a strategy and determine what that strategy is so that you can operationalize it on a monthly basis, so that you can, on a very routine basis, go forward. You know, another point I want to say here about the 60 days of NotPetya is this is less than a quarter. So if you try to do your operating system patching every quarter, then you're the sort of company that's going to be shut down, if history is any guide. Lesson number 3 is replace infected servers. Once infected, always infected. It's infeasible to completely clean out an exploited server, and so our recommendation, among others, along with this, is to, when you've had an exploited server, you have to assume that the entire system has been exploited. So if it's a virtual machine, basically what you want to do is delete it. If it's hardware, then in all known cases to date, we have the ability to install the operating system and update. There is the hypothetical possibility of hardware infection where the firmware and the BIOS type of control, or some of the firmware on the network card, that those have been exploited and modified. And for those reasons, it's best to run updates on those available firmware things. So your network card firmware updates, or your connected, if you've got video adapters, USB drivers, motherboard type of, and logic board type of updates. If those are available and you can update them, then that's best, because that will reinstall and should update a physical server. But you are, in a sense, talking about damaged goods at that point. With a virtual machine, you can delete it and can control it to date. I'm not aware of any exploits where you're able to damage the firmware on the hardware on a virtual machine, but I'm thinking someday this kind of thing will happen. But generally speaking, if we're thinking about it at the server, at the operating system level, you want to replace that server, which is to say you want to at least reinstall the operating system and start from scratch. You don't want to pull in old versions of the operating system, because these vulnerabilities can exploit a lot of things. You can exploit the kernel, you can exploit the utilities and the libraries in ways that are very difficult to detect. And in fact, you can exploit them in ways so that if you scan the system to look for changes, it may not be able to detect those changes because of checksum and hash vulnerabilities and things like MD5. So what you need in order to get ready to do this is a proven backup restore method. And as the joke goes, nobody cares about backup, they only care about restore. You need a way of restoring every system on your network so that you can replace any server when you need to. If you discover the server's been exploited, it's most important to disconnect it, trash it, and recover on a new server. Lesson number 4 is tightly restricting firewall rules. And so you want to limit inbound access from corporate, and you want to limit outbound access to the internet. So I've got a silly picture of the bot master here representing the machines that connect out to the command and control server. Exploits can cross from Mac to Windows to iPhone to Linux. And so if you've got Windows machine, for example, is my classic example. You got Windows PCs in your network, as everyone does. Then those software running on that Windows machine is able to launch an attack that goes out to attack and affect Linux machines or other operating systems. There's nothing necessarily intrinsic about one machine. So Windows viruses always attacking Windows machines. As the first example I showed a few minutes ago, we've got cases where a Windows machine is basically in effect attacked by a Linux machine in that particular case. But there's nothing intrinsically that says it can't go the other way, and it doesn't go the other way. There's evidence that it does go the other way, where you have Linux malware that actually comes across the network through PCs, or as I mentioned before, through thumb drives. And so we don't want to trust our internal corporate machines any more than necessary. We don't want to allow Windows PCs or iPhones or iPads or Android devices to have inbound access to reach in and touch our machines any more than we can help. So this may mean that you do have to do things like you have to allow the ability to SSH in for remote management, but you don't have to allow anything else. So you don't, a really common error that's made is the network is set up so that the management PCs are able to reach in and they can send packets to any port or any service on the machines, your core server machines, and that's not an ideal situation. A lot of times that's left over after the installation process, but it's still very dangerous. So that's one thing. So that sort of leads us to must-have number 7, which is the firewall must minimize access from the corporate and management networks. And so, the implication here is going to the core, either call control networks or your other operational networks, your operational support system networks. You need to minimize that access. Minimize, of course, doesn't mean shut down entirely. It just means you've got to keep it as lean as you possibly can. And that's often going to be less than you are going to have kind of by default. We have a habit of trusting our internal management PCs because they're being operated under strict policy. The other piece here is on the firewall strict rules is the command and control system. So usually the malware connects from the internal network and it connects out to the internet. So you have an infected system on the internal part of your network. It connects outbound across the internet, and it gets instructions. Now, of course, it may connect outbound to an intermediate machine, for example, one of your Windows machines or something else in your corporate network, and from there the connection goes to the internet. Or it could be directly from the internal machine out to the internet. So the simpler the virus, the more direct the path, the connection is. But the general strategy here is this outbound connectivity enables the command and control. Now, and this is Not pleasant because this makes a lot of our kind of management tools sort of more difficult. But it is a common strategy that you'll have traffic from your internal systems connecting to places they shouldn't connect, and those are how instructions or new software updates are downloaded to manage the malware. And so we want to block outbound internet access from our core servers. There's no reason that you should have your core servers designed to go directly out to the public internet. What you at large, what you may want is to allow them access to certain individual IP addresses or servers. It's a little bit more controlled to set up a VPN so that you've got VPN access to certain places so that you can control the pathway and control against man-in-the-middle attacks. But the unrestricted access from your core systems to the internet is not necessary and can be harmful. And you want to routinely monitor for Linux malware. So this is lesson number 5. This is a moving target. So in a lot of our systems, like I mentioned, the Linux is at the heart of our core infrastructure. The government is the U.S. government, and apparently others are working on malware to affect Linux systems because they know this is how you would cause the greatest damage. As General Hayden pointed out, though, he's not comfortable with the idea of the U.S. federal government developing this malware and then letting it leak, because that's what happened. That's basically how NotPetya and WannaCry came to be. Was they were leaked versions of vulnerabilities that have been developed by the U.S. federal government. And so we have effectively military-grade weapons that are being released onto the public internet and then used by attackers to, in the case of these big incidents in 2017, they were being used to extort money. And so we want to regularly monitor for news of Linux malware and get updates on what that is and how that affects you, whether this is malware that affects your platform. There are a lot of vulnerabilities out there that are not going to affect your system, but generally, without trying very hard, the easiest policy is to simply accept the updates, the operating system updates that come through, and basically not try to pick and choose. Picking and choosing is pretty expensive, and there is some risk involved. And so getting those updates as they become available from your operating system vendor is kind of the most effective, simple strategy for getting that. But then the other piece of this is preparing to modify your strategy to accommodate what's changed, because this is a form of arms race, and you're just trying to keep the walls up and try to protect your system so that your business can continue to operate. And so in this arms race, you've got to be ready to respond and change your method of doing this. So for example, perhaps it doesn't become the most obvious thing to do operating systems updates immediately. Maybe those OS updates need to be vetted in some way in addition to lab testing. Maybe we need to start thinking about after the operating system updates are installed, maybe we need to have some way of monitoring to be sure that they're not modified post-installation. There are things like that. And so as we learn more about that threat landscape, we can modify the way that we run our systems to try to provide that additional protection and to remediate against it. So this is the kind of work that we do, and we'll be glad to talk more about this or help you sort of design a strategy that's going to work for what you guys are doing. We do this in the public and private sectors, and including sensitive systems where this kind of thing is important to life and safety of a lot of people. And so we can help you with building the testing labs or designing and auditing your firewalls and firewall policies, establishing and auditing your OS update and practices, notifying you. We can directly contact you when updates are necessary for your system. We can monitor that. We can help you with the scheduling and execution, and then replacing the exploited servers. We'd be glad to assist you with that and designing the system so that kind of replacement is readily available. So those are all some of the kinds of things that we can do specifically to help prepare you for this kind of space, so that as Linux malware comes out and hits us the same way that the Windows Server community was affected in 2017, that we're generally in a better position for being able to handle that. Okay, so this is what I wanted to cover. I've got a few minutes left. I'd be glad to take some questions. from you guys if you've got any. Otherwise, this video is available in the link that you got an email, and be glad to for you to download that and look at that later. But if you've got any questions, feel free to use the chat feature